This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming, and today we're going to be making small talk about the small folk. Specifically, we're going to be talking about gnomes and halflings.
Yes, and for those who are wondering, we are leaving dwarves out of this and leaving some of the other small classed races out of this, largely due to the fact that they don't have similar issues or there's certain balancing things which make them more well-rounded. For example, dwarves are completely overpowered, and so the issues that we will be bringing up for the gnomes and the halflings don't really apply to them just because they're so overpowered.
Yes, and there are other small races you can play. For example, you can play goblins, you can play kobolds now. We're focusing on these because the gnomes and the halflings are in the player's handbook, but are still sort of underrepresented as races. Now, with gnomes, the main varietals, the ones in the player's handbook, are the rock gnomes, which, without going into a huge amount of detail, have some abilities that relate to artifice and their ability to both identify and work with artificial and magic items. And then the forest gnomes have more abilities that would be related to their ability to survive in the forest. They can inherently cast minor illusion. They also have the ability to befriend small animals. They don't directly interact with the animal like you would with a familiar, but they can communicate with the animals. And we're going to start with the gnomes and move on to the halflings in a bit. Now, Mara, I know you had some thoughts about what gnomes were meant to do, as well as what problems stop them from doing that. I would be remiss if I failed to mention the class of gnome that was added was the Svirfneblin, which I probably mispronounced, but that's okay. They're the deep gnomes who have superior dark vision. They have advantage on blending in rocky terrain, and they have one of my least favorite game mechanics, which is sunlight sensitivity, meaning they get disadvantage on almost everything in direct sunlight.
Yes, and so the thing that I noticed in reading up on them again for this video was the fact that they have the rock ability, the blending in with rocky terrain, which, first off, is such a vague thing. Just no matter what I'm about to get into, being so vague about an ability is just downright dangerous because it opens it up to the DM forgetting very easily, or there never being a situation where the DM personally thinks that that's applicable, whereas a well-defined ability should make it so clear that even the DM can't really say no unless he already predetermined that before the game started.
Yes, that's actually one of the qualms I have with the sunlight sensitivity ability is, for example, if I'm standing in the shadow of a building or the shadow of a tree, or if I'm walking through a forest in daylight but there's trees overhead, am I in direct sunlight? It's something that I've gotten into with DMs before. I've never made a full argument about it, but it's the kind of ability or handicap that is certainly problematic.
Yes, and so the thing that I was thinking, though, when looking at especially the Norse-named subclass thing, which I will not even attempt to pronounce without having the written name in front of me, is the fact that all of these abilities specifically tailor to one class. And that class would be the Ranger, because that rocky terrain ability sounds very much like a favored terrain ability. And if you know anything about D&D, you do know that the Ranger is one of the least liked classes, and the only redeeming qualities are qualities that were introduced in a book after the first one, which means that I think part of the reason why I believe it's gnomes were on, yes, are the most or one of the, if not the most underplayed races, is largely because upon release, there's sort of this PTSD, because people played them upon first release thinking, oh, well, Ranger is so cool, I'm going to play Aragorn, but he's going to be short. And then they do that, and then the Ranger sucks, and then they don't want to play a Ranger, but then they also have a bad association with the Deep Gnome and with, honestly, some of the other gnomes in general. I do think that even just as a whole race, the abilities tailor a bit more specifically to Rangers.
Yes, now, gnomes of any subclass do get +2 to intelligence, which does make them logically suited to be artificers or wizards. The rock gnome especially because of their abilities as it relates to artifacts and their ability to make tinker toys, is particularly suited to it. However, there are a couple of problems with making a gnome a wizard. One of them is that they have the reduced movement speed. As with the halfling, their movement speed is 25. That's an annoying mechanic to begin with. It's not necessarily going to come up very often, but when it does, it creates problems. Specifically with a wizard, one ability you would like for your wizard to have is the ability to run when they need to. So with the gnome, they're kind of losing ground. Granted, a higher level wizard is going to have teleportation and things like that, but at lower levels, when you really need it, they don't have the ability to just get away. Now, with the forest gnome, I think a really interesting possible way to play this character would be to do it as something like a rogue, maybe an assassin, or a burglar type. And the reason why is because having the minor illusion cantrip and being small enough to easily hide behind or inside of the illusion would give them the ability to get into places more easily than, say, a human would, a regular human rogue. In addition, the speak with small beasts, you tend to think of forest creatures like squirrels or birds or whatever, but there's no reason a small beast can't be a rat or a pigeon that's helping you find the layout of the place you're trying to break into. And of course, the gnome's smaller size does mean that they would be able to get into places others could not. And to sort of go with the obvious, if you went with the arcane trickster or rogue, you would have a rogue with some natural abilities that really bolster its abilities. And with the forest gnome, they do get a dex increase by 1 point. So there you have it, and there you are. It's really counterintuitive, but if you think about it, if you've got this 3-foot tall person that can get in anywhere, can talk to rats, and oh my god, that wastebasket now has a knife and is trying to stab me, that's a pretty compelling murdery rogue.
Yes, and we will get to the movement speed side of that a bit later after we're done with halflings. So I do agree with this assessment. And actually he brought up something which I wasn't aware of, which is the speak with minor beasts, which also confirms my theory that this class was largely dedicated to wizards and rangers. But there are alternatives to classes, and I think that now, with the fixes, quote-unquote, to the ranger that have been added in Xanathar's guide, I do believe that these are now playable for a ranger again, for anyone who had a bad experience with a ranger gnome. Now, try again with one of the Xanathar's classes. Don't ever use the player's guide ranger subclasses, and you might actually have a good time.
Yes. Now, moving on to halflings. AJ Pickett's Mighty Glue Stick channel, which we will link in the description, did an excellent video on the lore around halflings. I don't know how much of this was official lore and how much of it was things he came up with, but according to him, halflings are a hybrid of gnomes and other things. So if you have a gnome having a child with a dwarf, you get a stout halfling. Gnome and a human, you get a lightfoot. Gnome and an elf, you get a tall fellow. Tall fellows aren't listed in the player's handbook. I'm not even sure if they're in the current edition. Stout halflings get increases to constitution, and they get advantage on saving throws against poison, and they have resistance to poison damage. This is an excellent, excellent class for if you're doing a campaign against drow, if you're doing a campaign in a swamp environment where there's a lot of poisonous things. The Lightfoot get a bonus to charisma, and they get a natural stealth ability where they can hide behind creatures one size larger than them. So they can literally hide behind other party members. All halflings get a bonus to their dex, and they have the brave ability. They have advantage against being frightened. They have the ability to move through the space of any creature that is of a size larger than theirs. And they have the lucky ability, which allows them, if they roll a 1 on a d20 for an attack, ability check, or saving throw, they can re-roll and have to use the new roll.
Yes, and I don't actually have quite as many issues with the halfling as I do with the gnome, though I will say that my biggest complaint with them is they're both too generic and there is not enough lore behind them, and I think And Mordekainen's Guide does go a long way to fixing this. Sadly, we, for some reason, still don't have that book, but we probably will within the coming weeks. Anyway, the thing that bothers me, though, is a halfling is a hobbit. That is really what they are based on quite clearly. They actually didn't appear in editions before the Lord of the Rings movies, which is very indicative of where they come from. And then on top of that, the other thing is they're so classic to the point of being boring. That it's a similar problem with the folk hero backstory. It's been done so many times that playing a halfling isn't necessarily interesting if you play it based on how the player's guide suggests, and their lack of detail on really what causes the sub-races, with the exception of what is possibly fabrications from outside the lore, also means that you don't even get the quirk of playing a freaking half-genasi halfling or whatever it is. Instead, you're just kind of stuck with, yes, I am an exact ripoff of Frodo no matter what class I play now. And that, again, it can be fun, but it's just been done so much.
At the risk of overstepping my bounds, I will correct my junior here. Halflings were in editions prior to the release of those movies, but nobody played them then either. One thing that had occurred to me would be really interesting with a Lightfoot halfling, especially with their charisma bonus, that really does play well into the lore of the movies. In the movies, halflings are portrayed as being reluctant to go on adventures, but once they've decided on the course of going on an adventure, they agree almost too quickly, and they agree without asking enough questions. You really see that at the Council of Elrond, where all 4 halflings decide to go. And I think it was Pippin didn't even know where they were going. So,
what were we discussing?
Exactly. Now, where this could be a really interesting plot hook to me, because warlocks use their charisma for their magic modifier, you could have a halfling who's made some sort of a deal in order to maybe protect their village or whatever it is they needed to do, without necessarily understanding the deal they made. So, and this doesn't even necessarily have to be with an abyssal Pact of the Fiend type situation, although you could certainly go that way. Another alternative would be maybe they made an overly complex arrangement with a Fey entity, or maybe those of you who've seen the thoroughly insane and thoroughly brilliant show Legends of Tomorrow will know the character of John Constantine. At one point, he tries to make a deal with the Archangel Gabriel, and afterwards somebody is scolding him because Gabriel would have made you a slave. John Constantine is a short, very charismatic man who, basically the way that he's shown in that show, he essentially is a halfling and he is a warlock. Point being, though, you could have a halfling who, part of his deal with his patron is that he can't overeat, he can't drink, he can't smoke. He's basically, all of the things that he enjoys as a halfling are being denied to him because this angel is interfering with his life. Or you could even have it be something truly bizarre, like you've got a mastermind situation where the halfling's patron turns out to be the BBEG. You could go a lot of ways with something like that. Or if you wanted to go something a little more standard, you could do, a bard or something that sort of gels well with the halfling character.
Yes, and I'd also like to expand upon the comment of a warlock, because a lot of people think that Bilbo is a rogue, and there is some validity to that, but I'd also argue that he perhaps took a level or two in warlock upon the beginning of his adventure, because if you think about it, he signs a contract with a far more powerful being, with that being a literal king of the land who was helped by a wizard. And not just any wizard, but a godlike wizard. And so I'd argue that by signing this contract, Bilbo actually does kind of become a warlock. And if you think about it, he does display some of the characteristics of a warlock throughout the truly terrible movies of The Hobbit, whereby, for example, he picks up the plot gimmick, and its corrupting influence does not affect him, which is very similar to the Fae's ability, whereby they do not get charmed after a certain level because of their patron's innate magic. And so I'd argue that, in fact, not only can you have a halfling wizard, but you don't even need to have it be a godlike being. You could just due to how the halfling society operates, you could literally have your patron be Dave the big guy who walked through, and you were just like, hey, I'm going to help you now. So there are a lot of interesting ways to go if done right.
So we're going to have a brief discussion about movement speed and why this mechanic is problematic in both halflings and gnomes. Most races have a movement speed of 30 feet. Halflings and gnomes, their movement speed is 25. This is usually not a big deal. And in some ways, the fact that it's usually not a big deal makes it worse. I played in a campaign where we had a drow elf who had sunlight sensitivity, and that was an annoying mechanic, but you kind of get used to it and you kind of figure out ways to work around it. It can be an interesting part of the story when it's an ever-present handicap. The 25 feet of movement speed very rarely comes up, but when it does, because it's only every so often, it's profoundly annoying.
Oh, can I go and stab this guy? No, you can't. You actually only have 25 movement speed. We've been acting like you have 30 for the past 20 sessions, but no, you only have 25. So now you're gonna die on the third round of combat just because you lack that whole 5 feet, which you totally just couldn't lean over to stab someone.
Yes. So there are a few ways I've seen players get around it. I mean, one thing you can always do is rules are always optional, and as a DM, I've very rarely have I held people to movement speeds just because I don't think it adds a lot to the game. Now, if it's dramatic, if a character has 25 feet of movement speed and it's 40 feet away, like, okay, fine, you can't reach. However, if it's almost right there, I'm inclined to just let it go, and it's the kind of rule that I'm inclined to ignore altogether. Although there are some creative solutions to this, given that halflings and gnomes tend to weigh no more than 50 pounds. You can just have an adult human or dragonborn or whatever. They can reasonably pick them up and not be additionally encumbered. So there's the trope about the barbarian yeeting the halfling at the enemy. In one campaign I played in, our wizard was trying to escape from some goblins by spider walking up the side of a cliff, and the goblins were shooting arrows. I couldn't get a clear shot with a crossbow. I was playing a halfling fighter rogue multi-class, so a gnome. So my gnome just shouted, "Catch me," and jumped down into the wizard's arms, and was then firing his crossbow over the wizard's shoulder at the goblins below, much to the amazement and delight of the whole table. I'm pretty sure we should have failed our checks on it, but the DM sort of just permitted it, I think, out of awesomeness. We should probably be wrapping this one up pretty soon. We don't want to do another 25-minute video today. So I'm going to let Mara do her closing points, and I'm going to say thank you all so much for listening. If you've made it this far, please like, comment, subscribe, and share if you're inclined.
Yeah, so my last thoughts regarding movement speed before we truly finish up for the day are you do have a few options, all of which the DM will hate if you play correctly, which I think makes them all the more worthwhile, but that really shows my own playstyle. But you have the mobile feat, which every DM ever dislikes, which adds 10 feet of movement and allows you to take the disengage action for free or for a bonus action, if I recall correctly. It's one of those two. Alternatively, there's also the haste spell, which I think doubles your movement speed or something ridiculous like that. And so there are some pretty good alternatives. I will say that the Xanathar's Guide solutions are truly terrible. Don't take the Xanathar's squat nimbleness feat. It only adds 5 feet of movement speed. But I think that really is all that a player looking to play a gnome or halfling, or a player looking to see why anyone would be interested in playing those, really needs to know. And with that, I'm going to say, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. For more, next week we'll probably be doing either a video on the issues involving the rule of cool, especially. I personally think that we need to do another one on that. Otherwise, we're still sort of sorting that out, so we'll see you next week.